In spite of the length of the weapon, longsword combat often came down to grappling and wrestling techniques. So, and this was really came out of the sort of the knightly tradition. The knight had to be an all-round martial artist. He was not just a swordsman, but able to fight in multiple situations with multiple kinds of weapons and in a variety of different kinds of ways. The weapon that you see here is the dusak, a wooden training weapon used in Meyer's day. Meyer uses it very heavily for training techniques. It could be either of wood or of leather.
So my name is John Seidel. I'm the Director of Curatorial Affairs, and I'm really delighted to introduce you to this evening's speaker. Jeffrey Forgeng is Curator of Arms and Armor and Medieval Art at the Worcester Art Museum, and he serves as Adjunct Professor of Humanities at Worcester Polytechnic Institute.
So the subject of the presentation tonight, the historical combat treatises, is the reason why I'm here, not really just why I'm here right now in this room, but why I'm kind of in the line of work that I'm in. It's a journey that began in 1989 when I was a grad student at University of Toronto. I attended a lecture by a fight choreographer, the fellow on the right-hand side of the image there, Bron McAsh, talking about the sort of historical combat. And the presentation really blew my mind, because what he told us was that there were in fact books written back in the period that actually told us how these weapons were used. It was astonishing to me that this kind of juncture of two really very exciting things, the ancient texts plus arms and armor, and that one could in the modern day really rediscover how these implements were used. Bron promised to start a few months later a class for people who were interested in actually learning to do this stuff, but he shortly thereafter flew out, relocated to Vancouver to do the fight choreography for the Highlander TV series. So we were left on our own to make the best that we could of it. We got a copy of really the only in-print source available at the time, a compendium of 3 facsimile treatises of the Elizabethan period in English, and kind of worked through it as best we could, and started to reconstruct the methods of Shakespearean-era swordplay. And we thought, this is really great. It's really fun. Wouldn't it be cool if we could do the same thing with the Middle Ages? But it's a pity the sources aren't really out there. And a couple of years later, as I was flipping through this exhibition catalog from the 1980s of a tour of Royal Armory's objects that were brought to the States back then, I came across the page you see there on the left. And again, had my mind blown that there survived from apparently about 1300 a text that describes the techniques of sword fighting. I had no idea. In fact, most people, I think, even people with an interest in arms and armor, had no idea that there really was that kind of documentation that far back. And I couldn't believe that nobody had bothered to make this available. But on reflection, the reason was essentially that the people who had an interest in arms and armor didn't have the language skills to read this crabbed Latin of the 13th century, and the people who could read this stuff weren't really interested in arms and armor. So I made it my personal mission over the following years, while I was at the Middle English Dictionary in my free time, to translate this material. Eventually was in contact with the Royal Armories, who wanted to publish it. And so that's really what landed me that position as curator at the Higgins Armory in 1999. And during the the following years, I translated a number of additional texts of this sort, as many in this room already know, and they formed the basis of the demonstrations and teaching and classes and such that we offered at the Higgins Armory. And it was very, very exciting to be a part of this. This was a completely new field. Everything was new discoveries. There still are a lot of new discoveries to be made. And it's also happened at the same period where there was a mushrooming of this interest in historical European martial arts around the world. When we started at the Higgins Armory in 1999, there may have been a couple of dozen groups in the world that were doing something comparable to what we were doing. And this past week, I just ran the numbers that you see on the screen. It looks like there are something like 1,300 groups worldwide doing this. The number of practitioners must number in the tens of thousands. And they're everywhere, as you can see from the breakdown. So it's really been an exciting area to be involved in and an exciting time to do it, and definitely great opportunities for discovery. The number one discovery is that the old assumptions about medieval knights basically banging on each other with their weapons, and that the fight went to the strongest combatant, that this was all clearly not the case. The rough, untutored fighting that Edgerton Castle wrote about in 1892, describing combat of the Middle Ages, just not true. And indeed, looking at the material, we could realize that these were martial arts. Perhaps not the flavor of the better-known martial arts of East Asia, but with comparable levels of discipline, of training, of sophistication. And it makes a lot of sense when you think about it. The medieval battlefield could be kind of a dangerous place. And if you're going to get yourself involved in this kind of a situation, it helps to be a bit prepared beforehand. They had every reason to train seriously, and indeed we know that knights were trained to their skills from childhood. So they really possessed quite advanced skills, and we know details about them because of a very substantial body of written documentation, both from the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Prior to 1500, there's about 50 manuscripts known today. The number is always ticking upwards. And those manuscripts may include, in many cases, they include multiple texts within the same manuscript. So the total number of texts is arguably even larger than that. Most of these, at least about 4/5 of them, actually come out of Germany and are written for the most part in German. They don't have named authors. They make a lot of use of verse. Combinations of image, verse, and prose are very common. You see a great example on the screen up there. At the very top, that sort of big bold-faced text is a series of verses, and then the smaller text below it is an explanatory prose passage telling you what the verses are supposed to mean. And authors copied from each other extensively. In the Middle Ages, this was considered good manners. They didn't really have a concept of plagiarism the way we do. In fact, it's good scholarship was based on things that have already been written, so content would get recycled. Indeed, the text that's exemplified there on the screen was from the late 1400s, and a large part of it is basically lifted out of a text from about 100 and some years earlier than that. And there's a great variety of weapons. Blade weapons, swords, daggers, wrestling, staff weapons of multiple kinds, combat on foot, combat on horseback, unarmored combat, armored combat, a whole wide variety. I can't really give you anything more than just a taste of what these texts looked like. But that first one that I showed you is here, showing a particular fight sequence, and gives you something of an idea of how these things look, the combination of image and text, verse and prose. The italicized bit at the top right there is it's verse. It's much more poetic in the original Latin. And the focus is on a specific technique. So basically, these medieval manuscripts are compendia of technique after technique after technique. A lot of kind of specific sequences. You do this, if he does that, then you do another thing, and kind of building like that. After 1500, there's both continuity and change. The German tradition remains much more stable, kind of much more conservative. They continue to use manuscript transmission very heavily and still continue to recycle a lot of medieval material. Meanwhile, in Italy, things are changing much more quickly. They're quicker to embrace the printing press as a medium for transmission. And the texts themselves are also much more distinctly new in their flavor, as we'll see shortly. The authors are, for the most part, named. They rarely make use of verse. They generally try to emphasize the originality of their work as opposed to its roots in tradition. And that initial wide variety of weapons forms really kind of collapses over time to focus more and more on the rapier, on the civilian swordplay. And a little sample of that is on the screen here, the text by Giacomo di Grassi, an Italian writing in 1570. This is the English translation from the 1590s. And you can, even without reading it in detail, you can get a little bit of a flavor, even just from the diagram. Basically, he's using geometry to prove that if the point of your sword is not toward your opponent, it's better to cut than to thrust. That is, use the edge of your weapon rather than the point of the weapon, because you have to use two motions to deliver a thrust, whereas a single motion will be enough for the cut. And he says, towards the bottom right, he says, you can't really learn techniques for every single situation. You need to learn principles. You need to learn the kind of general underlying concepts that make these things work. Very different kind of outlook from the medieval sources. For the most part, the printed books are artistically unremarkable. The same is not so true of the manuscripts, quite a number of which are really quite splendid. The manuscript by Hansel Küchner that I showed you a moment ago, again here, probably made for the Elector Palatine in 1482. Really sumptuous manuscript in its own right, but they become even more spectacular in the 1500s. This manuscript was probably produced for another one of the electors, if not for the emperor himself. The sculptor, Gregor Erhardt, produced a manuscript. I don't think he was thinking of jumping ship into two-dimensional art, but he seems to actually to have been a practitioner of these sword arts. And you can see from even this rather simple, pragmatic kind of sketch, the underlying artistic talent, even if this wasn't his primary medium. The most spectacular manuscripts are three that were commissioned by the Augsburg civil servant Paulus Hector Meyer, and illustrated by the workshop of Jörg Breuil the Younger. And there's three of these, as I say. The one that's shown here was purchased by Albrecht V, the Duke of Bavaria, and it's the pages are about that large, and richly colored, beautifully illustrated, highlights in gold and silver, really precisely the kinds of things that were being collected at the very highest echelons of society. And individual prints were also being produced by artists as well on related kinds of themes. This print by Martin von Heemskerk comes from a series that he produced, and in fact this particular copy is bound in one of the manuscripts that Paulus Hector Meyer owned. But of course, the most famous name associated with these texts is Albrecht Dürer. The sketches on the right are by him. They're in the British Library. so there's really just a couple of sketches in his own hand, and then a larger manuscript by his workshop, possibly undertaken as preparatory materials for a kind of imperial level encyclopedia of these combat arts. And I said at the outset that the printed works were mostly artistically unremarkable, but there are exceptions, and of course that brings us to the core topic of this evening, Joachim Meyer and his Art of Combat of 1570. Really one of the most spectacular of the treatises, combat treatises of this period. Meyer was from Basel in Switzerland and a cutler by trade. By 1560, he was living in Strasbourg, now Strasbourg in France, but at the time it was German-speaking and part of Germany. And he practiced his trade there by day, and by night he taught martial arts and organized martial arts competitions, and in scenes that you might kind of suggested by this illustration, by this image. So he taught these practices, he organized prize fights, and he was not just interested in the physical practices, but also in the kind of intellectual understanding of them. By the 1560s, at some point, he acquired one of these old German manuscripts with texts going back to the 1400s, even the 1300s, and he added, indeed, some material of his own toward the very end of it. Around in 1570, and by 1568 he was also starting to develop content of his own, a work of his own, treatise on the combat arts. An early version survives currently in the Lund University Library, having been plundered by the Swedes during the 30 Years' War, and this manuscript basically forms the basis of his great work of 1570. And as you can see from the title page of the original edition, this was kind of an all-singing, all-dancing production. This was going to be totally over the top. It's a substantial work, visually impressive. The woodcuts are spectacular, hugely complex. So much more is going on here than just swinging swords around. And in order to get that effect, of course, he had to get an artist who could support it. He turned to Tobias Stimmer, a Swiss artist. We don't really have concrete or kind of his name. Stimmer's name doesn't appear anywhere in the images, but they're attributed to Stimmer on the basis partly of style, partly of location. He was known to have been active in Strasbourg, among other locations at the time, and partly to the monogram that you see at the lower right there, which is HCS for Hans Christoph Stimmer, Tobias's baby brother. Who was one of the cutters who actually executed the physical woodcuts on which the designs, based on Stimmer's and Tobias's designs. And they're fabulous. Every time I look at these images, I see more. There's just so much happening here at so many levels, and the combination of reality and fantasy is endlessly fascinating to me. These guys are doing real swordplay techniques, absolutely. And their clothing represents, I mean, it's kind of outlandish to us, but it's the high fashion in Germany at the time. The drummer and fifer at the side are actually a common feature of martial arts competitions in Germany at the period. There's even a water bottle hanging on the pillar on the right-hand side there, because sword fighting is pretty thirsty work. I'm assuming it's water, although actually beer maybe is more likely, or wine, because we are in Alsace. But the environment is completely fantastic. It is it's kind of an Italianate setting that never happened in Italy. There's just basically a kind of theatrical environment, extremely rich, extremely complex, and yet it seems entirely unimpressive to the cat at the top left. Yeah, I had to put him in there. I mean, you know, Cats is opening tomorrow. And the range of weapon forms that we see represented here is kind of a wide range reflective of the medieval tradition in Germany, starting with the longsword, or hand-and-a-half sword. We've got a really nice medieval example in the Knights exhibition. It was basically the characteristic sidearm of the knight in the late Middle Ages. But if you bring up the lights and bring out the pièce de résistance, we have, in fact, for you this evening, a recent acquisition. So we acquired this fencing longsword at the end of 2014 at auction. And it's really one of my proudest acquisitions over the years that I've been a curator. There are only 3 fencing longswords in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas, 2 at the Met, plus this one here. There's only 24 of them known to exist in the world. We're really lucky to have something like this. This is basically, it's like a modern fencing weapon. It's designed to flex. Bill is not going to show you the blade flexing because he's a conservator, and you know, the blade has worked hard enough during its active life. It's now out to pasture. But basically, it's got a flex to it like a modern fencer's foil, so that you can stab your opponent without doing an excess of damage. Likewise, you can see that the edges are blunt. It's got this kind of curious stepped profile, which allows the blade to be made quite thick, very robust, very blunt, while maintaining roughly the same kind of handling properties as a battlefield longsword. And then it's got the very rounded ends on the crossbar, the rounded pommel at the base of the weapon, and the rounded flat spatulate tip there, but very thin at the end. That's partly part of what makes the flex possible. It's also because the victory condition using this weapon was to draw blood. And so something like this, typically the target's the head. It's really easy using something like this to get a good little flicking cut on the forehead. Lots of blood, lots of drama, not really a lot of damage. And in fact, some of the techniques that Myers describes, actually kind of like modern fencers, deliberately flick the blade around your opponent's weapon to circumvent his defenses. So this is, you know, I'm really delighted to have been able to add this to the collection. It's relatively well decorated. Has everybody had a chance to see it? Mostly they're actually plainer than this. And that's actually true of tournament armor as well. We kind of, I think, often expect tournament, you know, kind of sport arms and armor to be sort of more ceremonial in quality. But I think partly because it just took a lot of punishment. In a way, you know, if you're using this, it's actually going to see a lot more action than a battlefield sword. So it tends to be built for sturdiness and robustness rather than for kind of maximum decorative effect. And so if our demonstrators are, I see that Kendra has shown up. Hooray, we weren't so sure that she would be able to make it out from Boston in time. But the longsword gets pride of place in Meyer's in Meyer's treatise, as it had really pretty much had in all of the German treatises that went before. It's called a hand-and-a-half sword because it is designed to be used either one-handed or two-handed, essentially a prerequisite for a weapon that a knight can use. Go ahead, you guys start.
You'll have to speak up, kids.
Yes, that's true. You're the more fun part anyway. So, and the techniques that they're using actually date right back to the Middle Ages. So the kinds of techniques that Meyer describes for this weapon can be found in sources all the way back to the 1300s. And each of the sequences that you see them doing is taken right out of Meyer's section on the longsword. Like the medieval sources. Yes.
You saw how that ended, but it could have ended differently. Sorry, I'm afraid.
And yes, you see, in spite of the length of the weapon, pray continue, I'll keep up with you folks. In spite of the length of the weapon, longsword combat often came down to grappling and wrestling techniques. So, and this was really came out of the sort of the knightly tradition. The knight had to be an all-round martial artist. He was not just a swordsman, but able to fight in multiple situations with multiple kinds of weapons and in a variety of different kinds of ways. The weapon that you see here is the dusak, a wooden training weapon used in Meyer's day. Meyer uses it very heavily for training techniques. It could be either of wood or of leather. And the weapon itself is a little bit unusual, but the techniques really are kind of universal to single-handed swords, a point that Meyer says. This is basically a foundation point for learning any single-handed sword technique. And Meyer also includes a section on combat with the dagger and wrestling. As you can see, the length of the dagger means that you're pretty much going to be wrestling by definition. It's all about grappling. In fact, and the weapons that you see, again, are wooden weapons as illustrated in Meyer. And they're not like the contemporary...
Oh, sorry, one more counter?
Sure. And you can see the same weapon in the foreground of that particular woodcut there, a wooden practice dagger, basically based on the kinds of sidearms that were carried by knights during, as part of their battlefield gear during the late Middle Ages, and also similar ones were carried in civilian use. So these weapons have a lot of kind of history going back to the Middle Ages, part of that conservatism that I mentioned earlier in relation to the German treatises. There's also a section in Meyer on staff weapons, the quarterstaff, as you see in the foreground, the halberd, again, they're nice examples in the Knight's exhibit, in the middle ground, and the pike in the back. In fact, the actual pike, it's a spear, probably on the order of 16 feet long. They're somewhat foreshortened in this case, just to fit into the woodcut. You're not going to see demonstrations of those this evening for all kinds of obvious reasons. We can barely fit the longsword as it is. But in addition to the traditional weapons, Meyer includes a section on the newfangled rapier, which he points out is a kind of a new invention from a German perspective, brought in from foreign countries, specifically from Italy. And he says, you may think that this is not something Germans should be doing, but learn how to use it. There's lots of foreigners around. You may have to fight one of them. And he gives actually an extraordinarily good, one of the best rapier treatises there. A lot of showing a lot of influence from Italy, as one might expect. And just to give you a flavor for the text, I put this up here. I don't expect you to read it. It's extremely dense. That's why the folks, a lot of the folks who were here spent many, many long hours of the evening getting together, reading through these texts, walking through the sequences, trying to figure out what the hell these guys were trying to tell us. But it does make sense. It takes a while to figure out. You have to kind of learn the vocabulary. It's a lot of technical terminology, but it is a lot very. It's very real stuff, recreatable, although definitely very much more in that medieval vein of kind of specific techniques, specific sequences of things to do. But there's also a modern component. This is one of the really great things that Meyer has is this diagram teaching you, basically setting forth a series of drills to do. You can see the outer numbers, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Basically, these are the 4 zones of your opponent, kind of a horizontal line across the armpit, a vertical line down the center, and you're supposed to do drills, practicing attacking in one area after another, typically from one diagonal to another, because that's one of the hardest transitions to make from the point of view of the defender. And he gives a lot of these drills, very systematic. So in addition to that kind of medieval content, there's also a very kind of modern systematization of these traditions as well. And the work was extremely well respected in its own day. He is mentioned by a couple of other authors, not only in Germany, but in Italy and Spain. Usually the Italians and Spaniards won't even give German swordsmen the time of day. But he garners a certain amount of grudging respect from the South, and he's copied by a couple of later texts in German, as you can see on the screen there. And the work also seems to have landed him a plum job. The work, it comes out early in 1570, and later that year he manages to get an arrangement with the Duke of Mecklenburg-Schwerin as fencing master at the Duke's court. And he sets out in early 1571 from Strasbourg to Schwerin to start his new job. Unfortunately, this is January in Little Ice Age Germany. We don't know exactly what happened, but he arrives in February. Within the two weeks after his arrival at Schwerin, he's dead. I assume that basically he caught a really nasty cold en route. And so his wife and brother-in-law are left to settle his massive debts, because producing this book, particularly getting the woodcuts made for this book, has been a huge investment. So one of the things they do actually is sell off the wood blocks on which the woodcuts are based. By 1600, those wood blocks are in Augsburg, where the second edition is published, and that's where we get the copy that we have here. It's lost its title page, but that is sort of the substitute title page from the current binding, which is of the 17th or possibly early 18th century. That is to say, as binding, it's of the 17th or early 18th century. The actual material with which the binding is made is considerably earlier. As part of this project, I was finally able to sit down, transcribe the text that's on the outside of the book there. Basically, it's a recycled medieval manuscript. I knew that from the start, because it's basically recycled parchment to produce the binding. I'd never really had a chance to transcribe it, check it out, figure out what it actually is. And you are the first, this is like the first public announcement of what this actually is. Circa 1000, it's a page from Boethius' Constellation of Philosophy, which is an awesome thing to have in its own right. It's quite old. And Boethius is one of the most widely read authors of the Middle Ages. He's an important figure. So it's got the text, is sort of the big letters going down the bottom there, and then commentary in the margins. So sort of latish binding, but with very early roots. Really a spectacular object in many ways. And something, like the longsword that you've just seen, something I'm really tremendously proud to have acquired. I got that also at auction in 2004. And back then, I could never have imagined what the following decade was going to bring. It was a pretty eventful and unpredictable 10 years. But at the outcome, if anything, Meyer is even more at home here than he was at the Higgins Armory. It's a great fit. Not just for arms and armor, but more broadly for the purposes of an art museum in general, and I think this art museum in particular. Our director, Matthias, likes to talk about connecting the dots as one of the main things that we really want to do. And that is one of the reasons I most love Meyer, because he connects so many dots. You've got the medieval, you've got the modern, you have art, you have arms, you have images and texts, you have two-dimensional works, you have three-dimensional works, you even have cats and dogs. So there's a lot of, and there's even more dots to connect. I really encourage you to come back and connect some of the dots for yourself when the time comes. We open next week, I believe, end of next week. And both the original copy of Meyer and the fencing longsword that you had the opportunity to see just now will be on display. I'm very proud of my WPI students. Two teams of students over the past couple of years together have produced the iPad interactive that is going to be displayed in the exhibition. And it's got all kinds of very fun features, including, if you like Mark Millman this evening, you check him out in 16th-century clothes. And demonstrating probably one of the sequences that you saw this evening, and probably the first ever turn-based combat game based on a historical martial arts treatise. It's all pretty amazing stuff, and it's been really great to be part of this project. It's such a great fit for what we're trying to achieve here. So thanks for joining me this evening, and special thanks to Bill and Matt, who brought out the longsword for us, and to Kendra and Mark, our demonstrators for the evening. Thanks very much.
Who was the clientele that was buying the Stimmer printed version of the
clientele for Meyer's book? Basically, it would not have been among the cheaper books to purchase. So I think I recall he was hoping he could sell them at 30 florins a piece, but I forget the exchange rate. But this would have been really one of the more expensive books. I mean, it's a big book. There's 60 woodcuts in it, like 60 individual woodcuts. That's not including multiple instances of the same woodcut. His price point must have been pretty high for this. Who exactly was buying it, I don't know for certain. But it wouldn't, there were definitely cheaper fencing books out there on the market. This one, there weren't a lot of copies made. There really very few survive today, which suggests that it was, this was sort of a deluxe limited edition thing. And Meyer was basically targeting, I think, the upper class. I mean, I think even more than any financial benefit that he might have hoped to reap from it, I think what he really wanted is exactly what he got. He wanted a job, and basically this book was his CV. That was what was really going to get him in the door of the rich and powerful. Because once he was in that door, he was pretty much set for life. He didn't really have to worry about the cost of the book.
I was curious about the difference in time between the swords that were demonstrated today and the foils that were were used, and the time difference in between then and the foils, and why the foils became more popular, or was it, and how it evolved?
Right, so you didn't happen to bring a rapier this evening?
Sorry.
Left it in your other trousers, huh? So basically, you saw the images of the rapier combat. And the rapier was kind of the fashionable civilian weapon in Meyer's day. And it's the sort of thing that a gentleman in Meyer's day or Shakespeare's day, I mean, they're pretty close to each other, wore on the street as part of his civilian attire. It was, partly potentially for self-defense, it was partly for dueling, and it was partly a kind of a statement of status. It was an age where you kind of had to proclaim who you are. And it's a weapon that's designed specifically for civilian combat. The blade is typically thinner, lighter, longer, not robust enough really for battlefield use, but excellent against an unarmored combat, chiefly one-on-one. So
this is more of like more of an army sword.
Right, so what you saw are kind of military weapons of the Middle Ages, or their kind of sport derivatives. The rapier is more of a civilian weapon, and ultimately it is the ancestor of the modern foil. So over time, rapiers became kind of thinner and lighter, and the foil is basically a practice version of a sort of very late version of a rapier, if you will. But there are foils, there are foil versions of the rapier. So you saw the longsword, which is a kind of a foil version of the longsword, that's a sporting version of a military longsword. There were also sporting versions of the rapier already in the 1500s. Meyer illustrates a couple of them. It's kind of an ongoing thing, to try and find a balance between safety and realism with these weapons. And eventually, the foil was in a world where people no longer actually fight with swords, this foil could become very much unlike a real fighting weapon. Things like those long swords, as you may have noticed, are very much kind of like real fighting weapons, because Mark and Kendra basically risked life and limb to give you that presentation this evening.
Though, to be fair, if I can interject, the Dizaken, the wooden sword-like things we used, are, in that respect, much more like foils, because you are, with the ones we have now, you can hit each other in the head and not worry about getting your skull cracked, though you might still lose an eye or a couple of teeth.
Maybe you'd like to talk a little bit about the short sword.
So yeah, you're thinking of the small sword. So the rapier, as I said, the rapier over the 1600s becomes sort of lighter and thinner and a little bit shorter as well. Eventually becomes the small sword, or gives rise to the small sword. If you've been in the Knights exhibit, you may have seen, you can't have missed it, the Wedgwood sword, the bling sword. Really spectacular, sort of cut steel, resplendent, shiny thing in the kind of very far back of the Knights exhibit. And that's basically a civilian sword of the kind that was worn during George Washington's period. And basically the modern fencing foil is a practice version of the same kind of thing, much less blingy than the one we have.
Well, thank you very much, Jeffrey. And please.
I was fascinated by the idea that people assumed that because Maus was a work that exists in words and in images, specifically drawn images, that it was somehow less true or accurate or less non-fictional than a work that exists in prose would or could